And we're live.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, we're live, so I'm just going to introduce you and then pass it over to you. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Sarah Gottwallace, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Committee, and I'm also a Holocaust historian for FSW. So once again, I want to thank you so much for deciding to spend your evening with us, listening to the wonderful story of Steen Metz, one of our Holocaust survivors who works with us, who survived as a young Danish boy in Theresienstadt or Terezin. And thank you for continuing to support Holocaust education. It is very vital, and it seems like it grows more and more important as the decades pass. So I'm sure that if I were to, or at least I hope that if I were to say how many of you have heard a Holocaust survivor speak, hopefully lots of hands would go up out there in virtual land. It's important that we continue to listen to as many survivors speak as possible, and even listen to the same person tell their story more than once, because maybe they'll say something that maybe they forgot to say before, or something else will come up during that conversation. So it's important to hear as many survivors speak as you possibly can for a few reasons. Firstly, because all of their stories are vastly different. And listening to more stories gives us more of an idea of what the Holocaust did to us as a culture and as a people. It helps us to be able to understand what it was all about and to understand these amazing, brave, strong people who survived the Holocaust. And also, very importantly, these amazing, strong, brave people are not going to be with us for the rest of eternity. So it's important that we hear their story so that even after they are no longer able to share their experiences, we are able to continue on and be the beacon of truth going on into the future. And most importantly, so that we can stand up against Holocaust deniers and say, no, you are wrong. The Holocaust did happen. I met someone, I heard their story, I heard their testimony, and you are wrong. So we can be the beacons of truth carrying on into the future and speak out against Holocaust denial. So as I say, Mr. Steve Metz is going to be speaking with us tonight, and he was a survivor from Denmark. So he is part of a very special, smaller number of people who survived. And he has a very, very fascinating story, as all survivor stories are fascinating. He loves to answer questions, so we ask that as you're listening to him talk, please feel free to type in any questions or thoughts that you may have within the chat bar that you see there, and we will be sure to moderate and relay those questions to Steen at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Mr. Steen Metz. Thank you, Steen.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good evening, everybody. It's great to be back participating in this very, very important Holocaust week. I believe I'm going to be the last speaker, but as Sarah mentioned, I think you'll find we all have a different story. It all depends what country we are from, the culture, the age, and the camp we were in. First of all, I want to share with you how lucky I am being able to talk about my experiences during the Holocaust. There were 15,000 children, 15 years and younger, that passed through the camp I was in. Less than 1,200 people, or less than 10%, survived. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about my experiences in Denmark before the Holocaust, about my transportation to the camp, the 18 long, long months and very difficult months I spent in camp, and then finally, the good news, the happy news at the end, when we were liberated. I'm sure there are a number of college students in our group tonight, and I want to share with you that you're going to be the last generation that will have an opportunity to listen directly to a survivor. In about 10 years or so, we may not be around, or we certainly won't be able to share our experiences with you. So I'm going to ask each of you, not just the students, but everybody in the audience tonight, to be my ambassador. Talk to at least 4 people, family and friends. Tell them you know the Holocaust took place because you had an opportunity to listen directly to a survivor. I'm often asked, how did I get started talking about the Holocaust? 10 years ago, I finished my book, and at that time, my oldest daughter thought it would be a good idea to talk to her son's, my grandson's class, 8th grader in a suburb of Chicago. I was a little hesitant because I'd never talked to students before, and I didn't know how they would behave. But everybody seemed to be pleased. And I talked to the teacher afterwards, to my daughter, and so on. Then eventually I talked to my grandson, and he related to me that a friend of his at the school came back, told him, "Your grandpa was awesome." And with that comment, how could I not continue to talk to people like yourselves? And that became the beginning of a new career, talking to people about the Holocaust. On the first slide, I'm showing a book which I authored, came out 10 years ago. As a matter of fact, it's in the college, and at least it used to be available in the library, an earlier version. This is a newer version that came out about 2 years ago. A Danish boy in Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt is the camp I was in. That's the German version. I will also use Teresen, which is the Czech version, Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. There was only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted future generations always to remember that the Holocaust took place. And Sarah mentioned earlier about an increasing number of Holocaust deniers we have. And it's impossible to me to understand how anybody that can deny it took place. There's so many films, videos, survivors, and so on, witnesses to the Holocaust. On the next map, I'm from Denmark originally. That's where I grew up. And I want to go back a long, long time. April the 9th, 1940. I was 5 years old. I remember it quite clearly. Hitler, that evil man, invaded Denmark by land, by air, and by sea. And you can see the country is surrounded by water. It was a short battle because Denmark was not prepared. They had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. It didn't mean anything. You couldn't trust the evil man. He had signed agreements, with 20 other countries, and he invaded all of them at different times. So there was no way that Denmark could battle the big war machine from Germany, and we surrendered after a couple of hours. I'm not going to judge whether that was a right or wrong decision, but I will say it probably saved thousands of lives. When I look back, I'm amazed that the first 3 or 3.5 years of the occupation's conditions in Denmark were almost relatively normal, with emphasis on the word relatively. They certainly were relatively normal compared to what happened in Poland, Netherlands, the Czech Republic, and so on. As an example, I was able to go to public school in Denmark. I would not have been able to do that in Poland. My father was able to practice law. So why were things different in Denmark? a number of reasons for it. One being, we only had about 8,000 Jewish people living, most of them on the northeast part of Denmark, around Copenhagen. Estimated about 95% of them lived there. There was a synagogue, only place in Denmark that had a synagogue. In the middle of the country, with a red frame around it, Odense, or you may call it Odense. That's where I was born and raised. So out of a total of 4.5 million, only 8,000 people were Jews. Consequently, Hitler didn't have to devote any more resources to Denmark than he absolutely needed. So he was busy on so many different fronts, especially the Soviet front. Also, and this may actually be the primary reason, we manufactured a number of food products. We used to send them to our great ally in Great Britain. Now we were forced to ship them down to Germany. You can see on the map the southern borders Germany, and we would be sending pork, and we would be sending eggs, butter, cheese, salami, and so on, and feeding part of the German population. And we would also be feeding the Nazi troops in Denmark. What's equally impressive and maybe surprising to many people, if I may have the next slide. On this slide, you see King Christian X, nobody around him, riding his horse in 1940. The two Nazi soldiers are saluting the king. He doesn't want to have anything to do with them. He's looking straight forward, and he hated them, and he was a big supporter of the Jewish people. There are a number of myths about the king. One myth being that he wore the Jewish star throughout the Holocaust, throughout the occupation of the Germans in Denmark. It's a wonderful story that he would do that to support the Jewish people, but it's not true, because we didn't have to wear a Jewish star like they did in most other occupied countries. The government was able to govern with some restrictions. But again, I want to emphasize how unique that was. On the next picture, if you recognize that young fellow, he was 8 years old in the summer of 1943. And if you do recognize him, I guess I haven't changed that much. But there's a much more important reason for sharing the picture with you. When I look back, I'm surprised that my mother, my father, and I were able to go on vacation. We had a great time. I think we were gone for about a week. Denmark was occupied. There were literally soldiers, German soldiers, on every street corner. How were we able to go on vacation and still enjoy it? It's amazing. But the relatively normal conditions came to a stop in the fall of 1943. Can we go back to the map that I showed earlier, please? Thank you. What happened in the fall of 1943? Young people, upperclassmen in high school, college, universities, were not very happy that Denmark has surrendered so easily to the Nazis. And they took upon themselves to form groups in just about any town you see on the map. One of the more famous groups started in my hometown. It was called the Churchill Group. How did they get weapons? How did they get bombs? They got weapons from Sweden. You can see Sweden bordering to the east coast of Denmark in the creamy color. That's Sweden. And Sweden managed to be neutral throughout the Holocaust, throughout World War II. They also got weapons from Great Britain. They would parachute them down at night and they would go out on the fields and pick them up. They learned how to make bombs. It was a very risky undertaking. A number of them were sent to jail. Some of them were shot by the Germans, but they were really what I call upstanders. They stood up for what they thought were right, defending their country. Had nothing to do with the Danish government, nothing to do with the armed forces. They would start bombing, accelerate bombing of rail cars, and first of all, factories that made products for Germans. Many of them being sent down to Germany. They were so successful that the German commandant went to the Danish prime minister and said, the saboteurs have to stop. You have to sentence them to death. There was no way the government would agree to that ultimatum. They resigned and administration took over. That became what we call the final solution, the start of the arrest of the Jewish people in Denmark. Once again, something very unusual happened. A leading Nazi officer heard about the arrest date, and we're now talking about late September, early October 1943. Word leaked to the Jewish congregation in the synagogue in Copenhagen. And over the next 2 to 3 weeks, many Christian families became upstanders. Yes, I love the word upstanders. If you can have bystanders, you can also have upstanders. Unfortunately, there were too many bystanders during the Holocaust. They were indifferent. They didn't want to have anything to do helping the Jewish people. So they would be hiding, the Jewish families, in their homes, hospitals, churches. Little by little, they would be transported over to Sweden. And I want to emphasize Sweden was a neutral country and were good enough to open up their borders for the Jews. And you can see the water between Denmark and Sweden at the narrowest place is about 1.5 miles. It was a risky undertaking for the fishermen that took the Jewish people across. Some drowned, some committed suicide because they didn't want to be taken by the Germans. But in total, 95% of the Jewish population ended up in Sweden. Unfortunately, my family were among the 5% that were arrested by the Nazis. We had not been alerted like they had in Copenhagen. Communications were so different at that time. We certainly didn't have television and definitely not the smartphone yet. We basically relied on radio. We relied on newspapers and phones, and the Germans cut off the phone lines, so we couldn't make contact that way. We were arrested one early morning. It was October 2nd, 1943. I was 8 years old. They had selected October the 2nd because they thought they had planned it so well, since October 2nd was Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, and they thought all the Jewish families would be home. Little did they know until they found out later that 95% of the Danish Jews were either in hiding on their way to Sweden or in Sweden. If we can move forward a couple of slides, that's perfect. We got about 50 minutes to get ready. We lived in an apartment on the 3rd floor. My family, to say the least, was shocked. Nothing had happened the first 3.5 years, so they figured nothing would happen by now. We packed, my parents, a couple of suitcases with important clothing. We were transported in the truck you see on this picture. We were standing there in the schoolyard in the middle of the town, Odense, and there are about 60 people in this picture. I tried a number of times with magnifying glass, but I cannot find my family. Later on, we were transported, on the next slide, please. We were transported to the western part of Denmark. And here you see a model of the cattle car, very similar to the one we were transported in. Can you imagine spending over 80 hours in complete darkness, uncertainty? We had no idea where we would end up. There was no light, no windows. They didn't provide any food or any water to drink. Fortunately, many of us had brought some sandwiches, bread or rolls, and we would share that in the cattle car. I can still see the frightened faces around me. It was very cramped in the cattle car. There were 4 children about my age. We were able to lie down. The rest of the people, the adults, they had to alternate between standing and sitting for well over 3 days and 3 nights. I'm often asked, did anybody manage to escape? No. There was one door which was locked from the outside. No other door, no windows. However, I do understand in another cattle car, there was an elderly lady that committed suicide rather than being sent to a concentration camp. The atmosphere was very, very tense. The smell was getting worse and worse. We didn't have any bathroom facilities. We used buckets in the corner. Got one stop, got some fresh air, got some water to drink, back in the cattle car. And on the next slide, you'll see us arriving in Tersen, about 550 miles from Denmark. We were about 40 miles north of Prague, the capital. I was then the Czechoslovakia. Today it's the Czech Republic. On the next slide, you'll see the train station on the left and Jewish people walking about 1.5 miles from the train station into camp. As soon as we arrived, we were ordered to empty our pockets. They took our money, they took our valuables, they went through our suitcases, helped themselves. It's hard to imagine that when we were arrested, and I believe it was the same with all other Jewish people being arrested, the German officers suggested to my father, make sure you bring money. You'll be able to spend it. Sure. Later on, we were split up into barracks, men, women, children, seniors. On the next picture, you'll see an illustration of the loft. It's very, very unique that I was able to stay with my mother. I think it helped me a great deal. I think it also was good for her. And I can never understand how she was able to persuade the authorities that I could stay with her, but she did. And here's a good description of the bunk beds we were sleeping on. In the summer, it was very warm. I would be scratching myself. My mother tried to explain to her 8-year-old boy about bed bugs and fleas, which I never heard about. I'll never forget, shortly after our arrival, or a couple of months, it was November 11th, 1943, now called Veterans Day. In those days, it was called Armistice Day. This was the same date that they had negotiated the peace agreement from the First World War. Hitler felt that Germany got shortchanged during that peace agreement. I think he forgot that they lost the war. He also felt that the Jewish people, some of them had been involved in the negotiations. And that's one of the reasons why he wanted to take it out on Jewish people. So one early morning, I think it was 2 o'clock, it was complete dark, and we were in our barracks, and there was a lot of screaming going on, and we were ordered outside. It was raining, it was cold, it was wet. They had a roll call, and we would be standing there for a total of 12 hours. Nobody got anything to eat or drink. There were people literally that fainted. There were people that died because there were a number of older people in the barracks. And we were told, don't touch them. It was a terrible, terrible experience. And I don't think I'll ever forget it. In the camp, there was slave labor. All people 16 years or older were considered adults. My father was exposed to some very heavy road work. It was very unfortunate because he wasn't used to manual labor. It was cold, the winter had started. He was used to litigating in the courthouse, working in an office, and suddenly he was out in the cold weather. It was very difficult for him to handle it. A younger man who worked in my father's group later on told us that my father was physically abused. He was kicked, he was whipped when he didn't produce what the Germans thought he should produce. He was also wearing an overcoat, and the German officer would literally tear it off his shoulder and say, you don't work with an overcoat. Easy to say, they didn't have any uniforms. My mother told me that he lost about half of his body weight, even though all people that worked apparently got a slice of bread, but that was nearly enough. He was sent to an infirmary where he spent about 2 to 3 months. Doctors and nurses, inmates from many different countries tried to save him, but they just didn't have the medical supplies. And my father passed away at the young age of 40, and he'd been married to my mother for less than 10 years. And of course, there was no way that the Germans would fill in the death certificate that he died of starvation, which he did. They said he died of pneumonia. To my knowledge, my mother was not physically abused, but she was certainly mentally abused on a number of occasions. She had many different jobs, working 10 to 12 hours a day. One job was in a factory. They worked with a mineral called mica. It came from the mountains in the Czech Republic. And there were groups of 200 to 300 women in a factory, and they would slice down the mica, and it would be sorted out in different thicknesses and eventually used as insulation material for the war machines. So an officer came in, asked some of the inmates how they were feeling. That included my mother. And she said, not very well. Why not? And my mother very innocently said, my husband died, and he died of pneumonia. He died of starvation. The officer left. All the women on the floor congregated around my mother and said, you shouldn't have said that. They could have shot you. And my mother said it was the truth. The same officer came back into the factory the next 8 days, asking my mother the same question. And now she had to say that my father died of pneumonia. Being 8 years old, I didn't have to work. My mother thought it was a good idea to do some voluntary work. Time would pass faster. Not much you can do at that age. I became a messenger, and I would take messages, I would take documents from one German office to the other. I would do that a couple hours in the morning and again in the afternoon. On my way back one late afternoon, I passed the kitchen, and at the end of the kitchen, I saw some big sacks of raw potatoes. I looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and I took, or I guess literally, I stole a couple of raw potatoes, put them in each pocket, and my mother and I shared them. We needed all the help we could get because we got very limited food. As an example, at breakfast, we would line up for substitute coffee, more boiled water than coffee, about half a loaf of bread to share within the family for the rest of the week. And on the next slide, you'll see us lining up at lunch. I refer to it as the soup kitchen. We were standing there with our bowls, wooden spoons, maybe lining up for 35, 40 minutes. It seemed to me they served potato soup every day. How they had the nerve to call it potato soup. It consisted of boiled water and potato skin. And we tried to get to the bottom of the kettle. At least we could get some nutrition in the form of potato skin. At dinner, different kinds of soup, but at least a variety, including barley soup. Once a week, we would get a pasta dish, typical pasta dish called dumplings. And that was a special occasion. How were we able to survive with such little food? 35,000 inmates, just like my father, died, most of them of starvation, malnutrition. We were very, very fortunate. All nations were allowed to get packages from their home country after 6 months. Unfortunately, a few weeks too late to save my father. The packages consisted of clothing, food, and vitamins. And one day the package was so heavy, and my mother couldn't understand why it was so heavy. She opened it, no food, no vitamins, no clothing. At the bottom of the package, she found 2 or 3 stones. Those cruel, cruel guards had replaced all the good stuff with stones. I'm not saying they got enough food to eat, but they certainly got more food than we did. And I can never understand how anybody can do something like that, as evil as it was to the inmates in the camp. I want to give you another story about life in camp. By this time, I was 9 years old. Had outgrown my shoes, and my mother managed to negotiate or barter with a Czech lady. The Czech lady got some Danish food, and my mother got some used shoes that I was able to wear the rest of the time in camp. Being 9 years old at the time, I didn't realize how valuable food was. It was like gold. I was later on told if you had food, you could get just about anything. I'm often asked, what did I do in camp other than working, lining up for food? I spent time with other children. I especially liked some Czech children. We managed to play very well together. We often played soccer, didn't have a real soccer field, didn't have a real soccer board, but the mothers took some old clothing and tied it together and we would kick it around. That was probably the only time that I felt the way a 9-year-old boy should. I felt free. I almost forgot that I was in prison. So one day the Czech children didn't show up. And I went back to my mother and told her. And she said, don't worry, they're going to be back. Maybe they didn't feel like playing today. She knew exactly what had happened to those poor children, but didn't feel it was necessary for her 9-year-old boy to know what happened. On the next slide, you'll see a Gestapo officer on the right supervising activities, inmates literally being shoveled into the cattle car. 85,000 inmates went in cattle cars from Terrassen to extermination camps with gas chambers, including Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's surprising that I didn't know about it until much later, but my mother told me about it, and the scenes were just absolutely terrible. I went back to Terrassen in the year 2009. I wanted to do some research for my book. I wanted to see it as a free person. My mother had often been asked, did she ever go back to Terrassen? And she said once was more than enough. And I understood that, but I felt it was important for me to go back as a free person. On the next slide, you'll see a memorial. And this was placed exactly at the spot where a number of children my age, we were forced to work with some cardboard boxes with the ashes of the dead people. There was a crematorium where they cremated the bodies. In the beginning, they buried them, but they ran out of space. And the operation started at the crematorium, and then hand in hand, we handed out the urns, so to speak, and eventually they were thrown in the river Elbe, just behind the trees. You can barely see there's some blue water. Later on, I found out that a friend of mine who was a couple of years older, he stood next to me and he turned the cardboard box around before it reached me because he didn't want me to see the name and the number of my father. Wasn't that wonderful? He was 12 years old. Just amazing that he was this thoughtful. Obviously, the Nazis wanted to eliminate traces of all the cardboard boxes. Sometimes Terrassen is referred to as a model camp, which is a misnomer. It was a model camp one day in June the 23rd, 1944. And on the next slide, that's how Theresienstadt looked at that day. The Danish administration wanted to see how the Danes were treated. Eventually, the Germans agreed to do that because they figured they could use it as propaganda. They dressed up the camp. This picture certainly doesn't look like a concentration camp. Suddenly we had stores, the products in the windows. The barracks were painted. New sinks. They didn't work. They never put in plumbing. It was just for show. School pavilion where a musical took place. Suddenly we had benches, we had green grass, and we had just about everything. They even had the nerve to send 10,000 old, frail people to the gas chambers before the delegation arrived. They didn't want to see them. They imported about 5 or 6 French children. They looked very healthy, had just arrived, nice clothing. They would be playing when the delegation was there. Later on, they were sent to one of the gas chambers. The delegation spent about 4 to 6 hours there. Red Cross people from Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. They never saw what the camp really looked like. They even gave the Danes improved dwellings. We lived for a few days in apartments, and as soon as the delegation had left, it was back to the barracks. The Germans took advantage of the propaganda. They had a German inmate, a filmmaker, film the visit, showing how Theresian looked like during their visit, and used it as propaganda. A delegation went back to Europe believing that that was the way the Danes and other nations lived in the camp. I still remember we had been threatened. Don't talk to anybody. Don't tell them what it's like. If you do, you'll be sent in transport to an extermination camp. I want to move on and talk about what I refer to as a happy day on the next slide. Finally, a happy ending to 18 very difficult months. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, Sweden was a neutral country. They sent a convoy of about 25 white buses to Tersen to liberate the Danish Jews. There had been a meeting between Himmler, the German officer, and some leading people in Sweden. And Himmler had finally agreed to have the Danish Jews liberated in the camp. There were about 472 people from Denmark in camp. We lost about 50. They died of starvation, just like my father did. Would you believe there were 4 babies born while we were there? 2 of them died. How 2 of them were able to survive? They had to hide because nobody was supposed to have babies. If the Germans found out, babies would be aborted. So we boarded the buses, and it was a miracle that the Danish and Swedish drivers could drive through Germany and back up through Germany. The war was still going on. There was heavy bombardment. And on the next picture, you'll see us just crossing the border into Denmark. When I look at that picture, you wouldn't know that we were still occupied by the Germans. Row upon row, welcoming us back, gave us flowers, snacks, chocolate, and so on. We were not allowed to stay in Denmark. We went on to Sweden. In Sweden, we were in quarantine for about 8 days, and they wanted to make sure we didn't bring any illnesses into the population. We stayed in a camp, but this was a much different camp than Tersen, near Stockholm. It was called Strängnäs, but it was very close to Stockholm. And then we reconnected with my family. And I'll never forget when my mother was trying to run and embrace her mother. They hadn't seen each other for 18 months or so. She didn't have the energy. She didn't have the strength. She had to walk very slowly. A couple of weeks later, on May the 5th, 1945, on the next slide, you'll see the Danish flag. And it was flying everywhere in Denmark, celebrating the German surrender after 5 long years. We celebrated in Sweden But I really didn't feel that we truly were free people until we got back to Denmark. But there's a history behind the Danish flag and May the 5th. May the 5th also happens to be my birthday. And I was 10 years old on May the 5th, 1945. And in subsequent years, they would continue to fly. The flag would be up. And I would tell anybody who would listen, friends and family, you know why they're flying the flag today. They're celebrating my birthday. Some weeks later, we returned to Denmark, forever grateful to General Eisenhower and the Allies for defeating the Germans. I was able to go back to my old school. I left while I was in 3rd grade. And when I came back, I was able to go into 5th grade. There's no schooling officially in any camps, but we had some lessons, especially from a young man that I remember in Czechoslovakia. And when I came back, there was a teacher that took me under her wings, and she helped me a great deal. It was very helpful to make the contact with my old school friends. I think it helped greatly in the transition from the terrible life in camp to a more normal life. It was difficult in the beginning. It was very difficult without my father there. And I'm not sure I really appreciated how difficult it was for my mother to be back while she had friends, good friends. But my father was no longer there, and she had to go out to work to earn money. And this may not seem, she actually worked in a factory for a while. This may not seem unusual, but in those days, housewives didn't work very often. Today, most housewives work. I graduated from high school about some years later in 1953. Then I went to commercial college, business college. I always wanted to go the route of business. Then after some temporary jobs, I joined a Danish food company in Copenhagen. They exported a lot of food products to other countries, and they had factories abroad. And I wanted to travel, see part of the world. Initially, I had special training in Denmark. Then I was in England, Canada, mostly sales positions. And then I eventually came to United States with the same company. And I've been in the United States since 1962. I stayed with the Danish company for a while, and then later on, I joined some other food companies. I was always in the food business, and maybe subconsciously, I wanted to make sure that I never went to bed hungry like I did just about every night in Terrassen. I retired in 1999, and in a few short months, I will have been retired for 22 years. When you get to my age, time flies. And then I compare it to the 18 months in camp, went very slowly, a lot of uncertainty. Would we end up in transport? Would we get enough food to eat? Would we get ill? And so on. I mentioned earlier that 10 years ago, I started talking to my grandson's class. And since then, it's become a passion of mine to talk to all venues, synagogues, colleges, high school, middle schools, and so on. Many of them out of state, including Brown University. And I kept record right from the beginning. And I had talked to about 87,000 people. And can you imagine if each of them talked to 4 people, that would make quite an impression. I can go on, but I'm looking at my watch, and I think this is a good time to stop. And Sarah, hopefully there's some questions and you can help me sort out the questions.
There are. I'd be more than happy to. Thank you so much, Steen. Wonderful story as always there. So we do have 2 questions so far. Eunicius, I think I got that name right. I'm sorry if I butchered it on you. They say, thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us. And they would like to know, do you think that children should learn about the Holocaust?
Absolutely. I think children should learn about the Holocaust. They shouldn't learn about it too early. I don't know if I'm an expert in that area, but I generally recommend 6th grade. I have talked to 4th and 5th graders, and they are unbelievable. They have read about the Holocaust. The teachers have prepared them. And I talked to a 4th grade class yesterday, and some of their questions for 4th graders were just marvelous. So yes, I think all children should hear about it. You may not be aware that Holocaust education is mandatory in several states now. It used to be 6 or 7, I think it's up to 12 now. That includes Florida, was one of the early states. That includes Illinois, New York, California, and several others. So yes, this was kind of a long way of saying, I think it's important that they learn about the Holocaust. Thank you for getting us started with questions.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you. And by the way, when I worked at the museum in Naples, we even would teach units to 2nd graders via Curious George, because the Rays, the authors of Curious George, were Holocaust survivors. So in a very appropriate roundabout way, if you will, we would kind of introduce children as young as 2nd grade to the Holocaust as well. So we also have a question from Lester, and Lester says, how do you feel about people saying the Holocaust didn't happen? He understands that it's very disrespectful in his opinion, but how do you feel about people saying that the Holocaust didn't happen?
I feel absolutely terrible. A high school student once told me he thinks they're crazy denying that the Holocaust took place. Maybe they also think the world is flat. But seriously, there's never been, to my knowledge, historical event that has been documented as well as the Holocaust. Eisenhower had a vision when he liberated many of the camps. He had his soldiers take pictures because he wanted to make sure that everybody would believe that, yes, there was a Holocaust. Many times, the denial is connection with anti-Semitism, but I mean, between video and films and Shoah Foundation in California, having interviewed or more than 55 witnesses, and there's been videos taken, interviews in Naples Museum, in the Washington Museum, in Houston Museum, and certainly also in Skokie, Illinois. So it's hard to imagine. I'm often asked, have I ever met a denier? No, but I would sure like to talk to a denier. Maybe maybe it'll happen one day. Thank you.
Anytime that I'm caught with talking to a denier, I'm always a little bit caught off guard. So, it's that hindsight is 20/20 effect. Because after I walk away, I think of all the things that I should have said and all the ways that I should have handled it differently. In line with this, though, there's a movie. I just was rewatching the movie, a movie called Denial, and there's a book by Deborah Lippenstadt about, let me see if you can get it without the light, denying the Holocaust. So there are lots of texts that revolve and take it on as a topic of denying the Holocaust, why it's wrong, why it's just utterly ridiculous. Last night, Dr. Bartrop spoke with us, and somebody asked a very similar question. And he said, essentially, I don't pay any attention to them. I don't listen to Holocaust deniers. If they say something, I don't give them any credit in my mind. I don't waste my time on them, that sort of thing. So very good question, Lester. You've had very good questions this week. Thank you for that.
Let me just make a comment, if I may. Interesting way that Dr. Bartop handled it, I thought.
Yeah.
I've seen the movie Denial some years ago. And I also heard Dr. Lipstadt talk. And she won a very, very important court case a number of years ago against some deniers. I think they were from Great Britain. Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good little conversation we're all having here. So Silver would like to know if people were forced to walk through freezing cold weather to the point that they had frostbite. I know that they had to during the death marches where people would walk and they would get frostbite. In camp, was frostbite common? Because as I say, I'm sorry, with the death marches, those were primarily coming out of the 6 death camps in Poland. There were other death marches as well. Were there any death marches out of Theresienstadt and, to the point where you would...
I heard about death marches, and they're just terrible. And the description in Elie Wiesel's book, Night, it's just horrible what happened. No, there was no death march out of Theresienstadt, and it was cold in the winter and it was warm in the summer, but I'm not aware of anybody getting frostbites, because I believe the people that got frostbites were the people that were in the death march. Thank you.
Thank you. So once again, here we've got another one. So Burke says, I want to personally thank you, Steen Metz. You spoke at my high school about 2 years ago. Thanks to your talk, a group of my friends were derelicticized. So they would be Nazis today, if not for you. So there you go. You're making an impact everywhere you go.
That's great to hear.
Yes.
They don't say what high school, do they?
He might reply back, or they might reply back. Burke, okay. What high school was it?
I was just curious.
Yeah. I'll let you know when that comes through. Once again, anybody, if you've got any questions, comments, anything you want to say to Steen, just type it up in the chat box and I'll read it off for him. While we're waiting for that, I have a question that I came up with for you. Even after we've been working together all these years, I know that we've talked about food and that sort of thing. But were there any things that you didn't do, or any food that you didn't eat, or you don't do or eat still to this day because of your experience? Is there anything that this experience in the Holocaust put you off of?
Thank you. I have to tell you that I don't eat potato soup. I had enough potato soup, at least it was called potato soup. I do eat baked potatoes, but I just don't eat potato soup. As a matter of fact, in camp, the first couple of days, I didn't eat the soup because it was just terrible. And when my mother found out, she said, Steen, you absolutely have to eat it or you're not going to make it. And that was enough of an incentive to start eating the potato soup.
Oh, Burke says that it was North Fort Myers High School that you spoke at.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have fond memory of talks there and several other schools.
Yeah. Go Red Knights. All right. Just waiting to see if any other questions come through. I can fill in a little bit of space here too, though. Do you have any memories of your father? What are your memories of your father? What are, some happy memories that you held on to of your dad?
Oh, thank you for asking. I have some very happy memories of my father. Before the war, during the early years of the war, we always lived in an apartment, so we didn't have a garden. So we got an allotment, renting some space to grow radishes, carrots, flowers from seeds. And my father and I would do that together. And I'm very lucky that I remember this very clearly. I even remember that I had the nerve to pick carrots and other veggie and go back to our apartment and sell them to my mother and sell her flowers. And I've been in business all my life, and maybe this was the beginning of my business career. Then I also remember my father taught me to bicycle. And in Denmark, just like in Netherlands, it's a transportation vehicle. I would bicycle to and from school, and my father would teach me, and he would be running next to me, and he would almost be out of breath. But you learn to bicycle at a very early age. Many people would bicycle to and from work because the distances are so much smaller in Denmark than in the United States.
Yeah.
So those are some very happy memories, and I'm lucky to have them.
Yeah, I'm glad that you have them. I'm glad that you have the pictures that you have as well. We've been talking with several survivors this week, and some folks have things and other just don't have anything. You know, they just kind of got out and left Europe and either left everything behind deliberately or didn't have anything to take along with them. So I'm glad that you have your memories for sure. So Silver has two more questions, two very good questions. First one is, if you had to pick one thing for the world to learn from your experience, what would that be?
It's a great question. I think we had to learn a couple of things from the experience. One would be, don't give up hope. I remember my mother was asked many times, did you ever give up hope? And she said, no, there was no way I could afford to give up hope with a 9-year-old boy. There were many people that gave up hope. They didn't make it. I also feel there's much too much hate out in the world today. There have been several genocides since the Holocaust, the latest one being in Syria. And I think it's time that we are kind to each other. We should respect each other, talk to each other, make compromises. And I think these are a couple of things that I have taken away from my time in the camp. There may be others, but those would be some of the major ones. That was a great question.
Yes, it was. Absolutely. I agree with you. Some people really promote tolerance, and I say we need more acceptance than tolerance. Because if you're tolerating somebody, it's like, well, I'll tolerate you being here. But acceptance is welcoming you to be here.
Yeah.
So Silver's other question is, when did you start telling your story and why?
I'm glad you asked. I started 10 years ago, and I started doing it to middle school. And when I had finished writing my book, I thought that was it. It was only because my grandson went to that school that my daughter made the arrangement with the teacher. So it went quite well. And it really gave me incentive to talk to other schools. At that time, we spent some time down in Florida, and I contacted the Naples Holocaust Museum and spoke on behalf of them and to schools that I arranged myself. And then when I came back to the Chicago area, I contacted a museum, Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, and I started talking to them for them. Initially, my talk was completely different. I read some passages from the book, but the question and answer session, Sarah alluded to earlier, has always been my favorite. And I love getting, not only getting questions, but very good questions that we are doing today. And the reason it's become a passion of mine and that I talk to many different venues is basically, I think I represent 6 million Jewish people, especially my father, and they're not able to tell their story. And I think I owe it to them because I'm so lucky that I'm able to do it, to talk to people. And as I said earlier, I want everybody to spread the word to as many people as possible so we can eliminate people forgetting about it, eliminating denial, and so on. And my mother lived until she was 90. So maybe we have some good genes in my family and I'll be able to talk for a few more years. My goal short term is to reach 100,000.
I certainly hope you can. How close are you?
I'm sorry?
How close are you to that number?
I'm 4 years away.
We'll get you there. We'll get you there. But you're getting close to 100,000 viewers, I would think, by now. You've got a lot of people. Excellent. Sneck has a question for you. Did you make friends in the camp, or was it more of focusing on your survival?
First of all, we focused on our survival, but I did make friends. I especially made friends with some Czech children that I played with. And I learned the Czech language phonetically so we could speak to each other. I don't think I could read it, but I could certainly understand it, and I could speak it. And I remember my mother couldn't believe that I could speak it, so she had me tested by a Czech lady, and I passed the test. So yes, we had friends. We had friends where the adults would bunt to each other, and we were all in the same boat, and we were all in bad shape, and we tried to make the most out of it. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so, yeah. Burke asks, do you think any of the guards at your camp regretted what they did?
I like to think that some of them were good human beings and they were just forced into doing it from the top. Of course, there were a lot of officers that were in court at Nuremberg after the war. And of course, they denied, they always said, no, I had nothing to do with it. It came from the top. So somebody was responsible. So I like to think that there were some, maybe especially younger people, that regretted what they did. But it was amazing in a relatively short period of time how Hitler could get them all together, right from the young teenagers to older people.
I know it was you were a little boy when this was all happening, but looking back on it, can you remember any instances perhaps of where a guard maybe turned their back or kind of turned a blind eye to something that they knew should have been a punishable offense, kind of piggybacking off of Burke's question there. Do you think that maybe some of the guards took it easy here and there?
That's a good question. I didn't meet anybody like that. I never heard of anybody being kind from my father or my mother or anybody else. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but you have to consider it would be very, very dangerous. If they had been found out, they could be shot on the spot, they could go to jail. So they really had to think twice before they did something like that.
Absolutely, it'd be very dangerous for them. Well, that's it for all the questions so far. If you guys have anything, oh, here, Silver just came in with another one. Sorry, one more question. Silver, don't apologize. We love all your questions. It's good. One more question. What haunts you the most about your experience? That's a good question. What haunts you most about your experience?
Oh, absolutely. Losing my father was by far the worst thing that happened. And it was bad for me, but I think it might have been even worse for my mother, which I'm sure I didn't fully appreciate at that time, suddenly being a single parent. So the loss of my father and the loss of part of my childhood.
Yeah, that's
the best way I think I can. It's another good question, but that's the best way I can answer it.
Absolutely. I don't see any other questions. Burke says thank you for answering his question, so he's pleased with your answer there.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Steen. If we have any other questions, if anybody thinks of anything, by all means, send those questions to us. Send those to the committee members. My email address is sarah.gottwallis, that's GOTTWALLES @fsw.edu. And I'll be happy to get your questions over to Steen. And I guarantee you he'll be happy to answer your questions as well. Steen, also on the screen here, you can see he's got his website, steenmetz.neverforget.com. Steen, if they want to get your book, can they purchase the book directly from you?
Yes.
Okay.
Contact me via the website.
And then I'm sure you'll be happy to autograph it as well.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
More than happy to do it.
Get you a little plug in there, do some PR work for you.
Yeah, thank you. You could be my Florida agent.
There we go. I'd happily take the job.
Thank you for coordinating the event and being a co-chair of the committee.
Thank you.
I said earlier, it's wonderful to be back again, talking to people in Florida. And thank you to Steve for running my slides. I appreciate it.
Yes.
And thank you, first of all, to all the people that had an opportunity to turn in tonight. And please remember, spread the word to as many people as possible. Thank you so much and good evening.
Yes, thank you, Steen. All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve, for taking care of us tonight. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.